The Germans called this place Das Gespenst, the Ghost. Elite Wehrmacht tank aces, men who had rolled across half of Europe, were losing their minds here. They reported to command that a camouflaged battery, or some new secret weapon, was working against them. In their worst nightmares, they couldn't have dreamed that an entire sector of the front was being held by a single, long-battered tank. A tank that, by all laws of physics and medicine, should have been an iron tomb. Inside this freezing steel box, there were no poster heroes. Inside was something that made even military doctors avert their eyes. A symbiosis of two men who were doomed individually, but together transformed into a perfect killing machine. One of them couldn't see the light, the other couldn't control his body. How could a blind gunner destroy a column of vehicles? Why did they fire through brick walls without seeing the target? And why did Soviet newspapers refuse to print the truth about this feat, calling it too gruesome for the reader? Read to the end to learn the story of a crew that proved, even after death, you can remain in formation. A strike of 75 millimeters on the gun mantlet isn't a sound. It is the physical displacement of air from the lungs. The world ceased to exist at 1400 hours Moscow time, November 1942, Stalingrad. The tractor factory district. The German slug didn't penetrate the frontal armor, but the kinetic energy of the impact turned the interior of the T-34 into an acoustic hell. The steel screamed like a living thing being skinned alive. Inside the fighting compartment, this scream took on the density of a sledgehammer striking directly against the eardrums. Grigoriev didn't pull back from the sight in time. It was a split-second mistake. The periscope, designed to bring the enemy closer, instantly became buckshot. Shards of multi-layered glass sprayed inward, turning the gunner's eyeballs into a bloody mess. The light went out. It didn't dim. It didn't fog over. It was switched off like a breaker. Abruptly. Forever. There was no pain in the first second. Only the cold surprise of an organism deprived of its main channel of connection with reality. Grigoriev instinctively threw his hands to his face, but his fingers encountered a wet, sticky mask of his own blood and glass. A meter away, in the driver's compartment, the mechanic driver Voronov took the blow with his whole body. The armor that saved them from direct penetration transmitted a vibration so powerful it passed through his muscles and slammed into his central nervous system. He was thrown against the levers. His head snapped back like a rag doll's. Severe concussion. The vestibular system shut down. Earth and sky swapped places in a wild carousel. Voronov tried to inhale, but his diaphragm spasmed. His hands began to shake in an uncontrollable dance, a fine, nasty tremor that couldn't be stilled by willpower. The V-2 engine sneezed black smoke and stalled. The silence that followed the impact was more terrifying than the roar. It was a cottony, ringing silence, through which a whine in the ears barely broke through, thin, on the edge of ultrasound. The T-34-76, 26 tons of alloyed steel, instantly turned from a fighting machine into a cooling iron coffin. The temperature inside began to drop, equalizing with the freezing November outside, but the air was stifling, a mix of burnt insulation, spent powder gases, diesel fuel, and the sharp metallic smell of fresh blood. Grigoriev screamed. The scream was soundless to him, but he felt his throat tearing. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids wouldn't obey, and the attempt to move caused flashes of white pain in his brain. The darkness was dense, tangible. It pressed on his shoulders, clogged his nose. For a gunner, whose life consisted of finding reference points, ranges, and angular values, this darkness was a death sentence. He groped in the void, bruising his knuckles on the breech of the F-34 gun. The cold metal of the cannon was the only thing that remained unchanged in this shattered world. "Lesha!" Grigoriev's voice broke into a wheeze. "Lesha, I can't see. Give me some light. Why is it dark?" Voronov heard him as if through a layer of water. The sounds arrived with a delay, distorted, stretched. He tried to answer, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Nausea rolled up to his throat. He yanked the friction clutch lever toward himself, but his fingers slipped off. His fine motor skills had failed. He looked at his hands as if they were foreign objects, dirty, oily, shaking as if hooked up to an electric current. It seemed to him that the tank was continuing to spin around its axis, even though the tracks were frozen solid into the rubble of the factory ruins. Outside, beyond 45 millimeters of armor, the battle for the tractor factory was boiling. Machine guns were working there, mortars were bursting, but here, in a closed space of a couple of cubic meters, time had stopped. Isolation from the outside world became absolute. They were locked in a steel box in the middle of a destroyed city, two broken mechanisms that just a minute ago had been a unified crew. Grigoriev slid from his seat onto the floor of the fighting compartment, slipping on spent shell casings. The casings chimed, rolling under his feet, each one a reminder that just recently he could see, he could shoot. He was alive. Now he was a piece of meat locked in the dark. He felt his face again. The shards of the periscope were embedded deep. Blood flowed down his collar, warm and thick. Panic began to recede, giving way to the cold animal terror of realization. He was useless. In war, uselessness equals death. Voronov finally managed to unclench his teeth. His jaw was cramping. "Alive?" The word came out short, barking, without intonation. "My eyes, Lisha. My eyes are blown out." Grigoriev said this not to his friend, but to the darkness before him. "I'm blind. Completely." The mechanic turned his head with difficulty. His neck crunched. Through the murky veil of the concussion, he saw the gunner. He was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the ammo rack, his face turned into a red mask. Voronov tried to assess the situation, but the thought slipped away. The Germans were somewhere nearby. Maybe 100 meters, maybe 10. The tank stood like a target, motionless, blind, deaf. Grigoriev felt for the holster on his belt. His fingers, deprived of sight, moved surprisingly confidently. Muscle memory worked faster than reason. He pulled out his Tokarev. The weight of the blued steel was calming. It was a simple solution. Logical. Why have a blind gunner in a tank? Ballast. A burden. He brought the barrel to his chin. The metal cooled his skin, creating a contrast with his burning eye sockets. "Go, Lisha," he whispered. "Get out to our lines through the escape hatch. I'll cover you. With my body." The sound of the hammer cocking in the tight space sounded like the crack of a whip. This click pierced through the ringing in Voronov's ears, forcing his brain to engage. Self-preservation instinct multiplied by anger. Voronov couldn't let that happen. Not here. Not like this. He lunged from the driver's hatch into the fighting compartment. His body wouldn't obey, his legs got tangled, but he fell onto Grigoriev, knocking his hand aside. The shot blasted into the floor, the bullet ricocheted off the bottom and went into the turret wall with a ring. The smell of gunpowder became unbearable. Voronov threw his whole weight on the gunner, pinning his hand with the pistol to the ribbed floor. He was shaking, his teeth were chattering, but his grip was iron. The grip of a man holding on to his last chance. "Stand down!" Voronov wheezed right into his friend's bloodied face. "Stand down on dying, They lay on the cold metal, in a pile of casings and rags, the blind and the concussed, two fragments of human destinies being ground by the millstones of Stalingrad. War has no patience for the weak, but it didn't yet know that weakness could become the foundation for something more terrible than mere strength. In this absolute darkness, accompanied by nearby explosions, a transformation was beginning. The T-34 tank ceased to be a machine. It was becoming a prosthetic. The Tokarev clattered against the corrugated iron floor, knocked away by a blow into which Voronov had put his remaining coordination. The smell of burnt powder from the accidental shot, mixed with the sour stench of vomit and the heavy reek of transmission oil. In the cramped fighting compartment, where two healthy men barely had room to maneuver, two cripples were now grappling. Voronov lay on top, pressing the gunner against the breech. His hands, seized by a coarse, uncontrollable tremor, beat against Grigoriev's shoulders, not so much holding him down as transmitting the vibration of his damaged brain. "Fool!" Voronov spat the word out, along with bloody saliva. "Where do you think you're going? To the scrap heap?" Grigoriev didn't resist. His face, slashed by glass, was turned toward the ceiling, to the point where for a sighted man there would be a hatch, but for him, there now existed only an endless black funnel. "I'm empty, Lesha." The gunner's voice sounded flat, devoid of overtones, like the sound of a dented membrane. "I'm ballast. I have no picture. I don't know where the enemy is. I don't know where we are. Leave me." Voronov unclenched his fingers and pulled away with difficulty, hitting his back against the ammo rack stanchion. His chest was heaving. He raised his palms to his face. They were dancing in the air, the fingers living their own life, separate from his mind. The concussion had turned his body into a loose mechanism with broken connections. "Look at my hands, Ilya," the mechanic wheezed, forgetting that his friend couldn't see. "Look! I can't even hold a flywheel, let alone roll a cigarette. I see the German, but I can't aim the gun. The sight is jumping like mad. If I sit at the gun, we'll send shells into the sky." Silence hung in the tank, broken only by the ping of cooling metal. The hull of the T-34, having absorbed thousands of joules of kinetic energy, crackled, giving off heat to the November air. "You act as my hands," Voronov said firmly. The words came to him with difficulty. Each one had to be pushed through a spasming throat. "And I act as your eyes. That's the only math we have left." Grigoriev slowly raised his hand. He moved cautiously, as if afraid of burning himself on the air. His fingers found the cold steel handle of the turret traverse mechanism. A familiar shape, smooth metal polished by palms. It was the only thing that hadn't changed in his world. He squeezed the handle. His fingers settled into the grooves confidently, firmly. Muscle memory, built up over months of fighting from the Don to the Volga, engaged instantly. Here, on a tactile level, he was still an ace. "Symbiosis," whispered Grigoriev. It wasn't an agreement, but a statement of fact. "How do we work?" Voronov moved to the commander's seat, but quickly realized his vestibular system couldn't handle the turret rotation. Nausea rose to his throat in a black wave. He slid down to his driver's hat. There, pressing his forehead against the periscope, he had a narrow but clear sector of view. The tank was facing the breach in the factory wall. The firing sector was frontal, plus or minus 30 degrees. "Listen to my command." Voronov's voice became hard, metallic, devoid of human softness. Now it was the voice of a ballistic computer. "Forget the optics. Your world is now the hand wheels and the breach." They began calibration. It was a torturous, messy process of inventing a new language of murder. "Turret right!"
Voronov commanded. Grigoriev spun the handwheel. "Stop!" the mechanic shouted. "Too much! You overshot by 10 mils. Ilya, listen to me. 1 full turn of the handwheel is your unit of length. Half a turn is precision. A quarter turn is life." Grigoriev nodded. The blood on his face had dried into a crust, tightening his skin. He began to rotate the handwheels, listening to the mechanics of the tank. Before, he aimed by the crosshairs, trusting his eyes.
Now he was learning to trust the gears. He felt the teeth catching on each other, the heavy turret overcoming inertia. He learned to feel the weight of the 76mm barrel through the resistance of the handle. "Give me a reference point," the gunner asked. "Straight ahead, a brick chimney. Range 300. That's our zero." Voronov looked through the slit of the periscope, trying to calm the trembling in his knees. "Right of the chimney, a destroyed workshop. Left, an embankment." They divided the space in front of the tank into sectors. There was no more, "over there by the trash pile." There were clear coordinates. "Azimuth 2, elevation 05. Voronov translated the visual picture of the destroyed factory into dry numbers of turns and clicks. Grigoriev translated the numbers into hand movements. "Load," the mechanic commanded. Grigoriev turned in the tight space. Now the hardest task became the ammo rack. In total darkness, he fumbled with his hands along the wall, feeling for the cold bases of the casings. High explosive fragmentation. The fuse head was rough. Armor piercing, a smooth, blunt slug. He pulled out a high explosive, feeling its weight, 6 kilograms of cast death. Turn, knee hitting the seat. Find the breech tray. The shell went into the chamber with a characteristic oily sound. The clang of the wedge breech block sounded in the silence like the cocking of a hammer on a scaffold. "Ready," Grigoriev exhaled. "Again," Voronov ordered ruthlessly. "Unload. And again, until you can do it faster than your heart beats." They trained for an hour, or an eternity. Time in the locked tank lost its linearity. Grigoriev scraped his skin against the mechanisms, but with each repetition, his movements became more economical. He stopped groping in the void. His hands now knew the exact trajectory from the rack to the breech. He learned to determine the type of shell by a momentary touch, distinguishing them like a surgeon distinguishes instruments blindly. High explosive, to tear the soft flesh of infantry. Armor piercing, to break the spines of machines. Voronov fought his own body. The concussion rolled in waves of nausea. Colored spots swam before his eyes, but he forced himself to focus on the sector of view. He learned to speak shortly, abruptly, cutting off everything superfluous. In their dialogue, there was no room left for please or maybe, only order and execution. "Left half turn." Click, click, click. 3 clicks of the mechanism. "Stop. Lock it." Inside the tank, a new anatomy formed. 2 crippled men fused with the machine and with each other. Voronov's nervous system closed the circuit to Grigoriev's muscles via voice connection. The tank ceased to be just equipment. It became an exoskeleton for 2 souls unwilling to die. The smell of burning and blood stopped being irritating. It became their natural habitat. "Ilya!" Voronov called quietly, not looking away from the periscope. "Do you feel it?" "What?" "The vibration." Grigoriev pressed his shoulder against the armor. Through the metal, through the tracks frozen into the ground, a tremor was transmitted. Rhythmic, heavy. Not from explosions, from movement. "Heavies are coming," said the blind gunner. He didn't hear the sound of engines outside, but his body, having become part of the tank, read the oscillations of the soil. 20 tons, no less. From the right, 40 degrees. Voronov strained his vision. In the gray twilight, among the ruins of the workshop, a shadow flickered. A square silhouette, a characteristic muzzle brake. A 4, the mechanic exhaled. Panzer 4, and infantry behind it. There was no fear. The place of fear was taken by icy functionality. The mechanism was assembled, tuned, lubricated with sweat and blood.
Now it had to be tested.
High explosive, Voronov commanded. Infantry to the front. Reference point, the bent beam. High explosive up. Grigoriev's hands slid to the gun breech. Click. Readiness. Now they were one whole. A blind giant with an iron fist and his small, shaking guide. Ahead was darkness for one, and death for both. But right now, in this second, a spark of life flared up inside the steel box, fed by pure rage. The Germans didn't shoot. In Wehrmacht logic, wasting shells on a dead tank was a violation of discipline. The T-34 stood motionless, its cannon buried in the gray gloom of the Stalingrad sky. Smoke from burnt diesel lazily crept along the armor, creating the perfect illusion of final destruction. For the infantry squad moving out from the ruins of the assembly shop, this hunk of Soviet iron was just decoration, part of the landscape of destruction, as safe as a pile of broken bricks. Voronov watched them through the cloudy glass of the periscope. His pupils dilated, trying to take in the entire panorama of the battle, while his body continued to vibrate treacherously. He saw their faces, relaxed, confident. They walked at full height, carbines lowered, sure of their impunity. It was a fatal mistake, to mistake stillness for death. "Infantry!" the mechanic rasped. His voice trembled, but the words fell into the intercom heavily, like stones. "Open ground. Reference point, boiler house chimney." Grigoriev nodded in the total darkness. His hands lay on the hand wheels, fingers digging into the metal. "I hear you," he responded briefly. "Give me the correction." "Right 2 turns," Voronov commanded. "Range 300, high explosive." Time, which had been flowing like thick grease, suddenly compressed into a tight spring. Grigoriev began the rotation. 1, 2. In his consciousness, there were no Germans, no ruins. There was only the angle of turret rotation translated into muscular effort. The gears of the turret ring rumbled dully, turning the multi-ton structure. For the gunner, it was the sound of hope. For the Germans outside, the creak of a coffin lid. 2 turns complete, the blind man reported. Voronov bored his gaze into the observation device. The barrel of the F-34 slowly crawled to the right, covering the group of gray-green figures with the black pupil of the muzzle. The mechanic saw one of the soldiers stop, shout something, and point at the tank. It was starting to dawn on them. Too late. "Level!" Voronov shouted, seeing the barrel looking slightly above their heads. "Down half a turn! Fast, Ilya, fast!" Grigoriev yanked the elevation handwheel. His world narrowed to the tactile sensations in his palms and his friend's voice in the headphones. He didn't see the enemy, but he felt their presence with his skin, felt the gazes aimed at them. "Ready!" he exhaled. "Fire!" Voronov's scream broke into a squeal. Grigoriev stomped on the firing pedal. It wasn't just a press. It was the release of accumulated rage. The firing pin struck the primer. 76 millimeters of steel and explosives left the barrel channel at a speed of 600 meters per second. Inside the tank, the physics of the shot felt like a sledgehammer blow to the hull. The breech flew back with monstrous force on the recoil, barely missing the gunner's shoulder. The automation worked flawlessly. The breech block wedge dropped, the extractor tore out the red-hot casing and threw it onto the floor. The ring of the brass casing on the floor sounded clearer and louder than any bell. Powder gases filled the fighting compartment with acrid fog. Grigoriev inhaled this poison deeply. It was the smell of life. The tank rocked on its suspension. The Christie springs creaked, accepting the recoil, and froze again. Outside, 300 meters away, the world tore apart. The O-350 high-explosive shell hit the concrete base of the chimney, right in the center of the group. The instant action fuse turned the steel body of the shell into thousands of razor-sharp fragments. The blast wave mixed bodies, brick dust, and frozen earth into a single bloody cloud. Those who a second ago were marching on the attack ceased to exist as a combat unit. In the headset headphones, through the crackle of static, the panicked voice of Company Commander Belov broke through. Third, are you burning? Abandoned vehicle, crew, get out!" Belov saw the muzzle flash, saw the smoke, but he couldn't believe that a tank with shattered optics and a concussed crew was capable of snapping back. To him, this was agony, the last breath of a dying beast that might take its own with it. Voronov, blinking away tears caused by the stinging in his eyes, pressed the throat mic switch. His hand was still shaking, but his voice, passed through the carbon membranes, sounded frighteningly calm. "I am third. We are in formation, continuing the work." Grigoriev, hearing his friend's answer, felt for the next casing on the floor. His movements became sharp, predatory. Fear vanished, burned out by the adrenaline of the first hit. "Lesha," he said quietly, driving a new shell into the breach. The lock clanged shut. "Give me the next one." In this short dialogue, there was no triumph, only the statement of a new reality. They were no longer invalids. They had become a symbiotic organism where the defect of one was compensated by the function of the other. The T-34 tank ceased to be simply the sum of its tactical and technical characteristics. It gained a soul, black, crippled, but absolutely lethal. The war for them was just beginning. 7 days, 168 hours of continuous vigil. During this time, the T-34 finally ceased to be a vehicle. It grew into the ruins of Workshop Number 3, becoming part of its tortured architecture. The tracks were buried in brick dust and snow, the turret covered in ash from burnt ceilings. From the outside, it was just a dead mound of metal, one of thousands of carcasses littering Stalingrad. But inside this mound, a pulse beat. The tank turned into a long-term firing point. The crew no longer thought about maneuvering. The concept of speed disappeared, only the concept of rate of fire remained. Life narrowed to the size of the fighting compartment. They slept in turns, curled up on hard seats, waking from the cold that chilled to the bone. They ate rusks, tasting nothing, washing them down with rusty water from the tank. All physiological needs were relieved into a 76mm shell casing, throwing it out through the escape hatch. War here had lost any veneer of romance, turning into the heavy, dirty work of sewage cleaners. Grigoriev changed. Having lost his sight, he began to mutate. His brain, deprived of 90% of incoming information, reallocated resources to auditory centers. In absolute darkness, his ears became locators. He learned to filter the acoustic chaos of battle. He didn't just hear explosions, he heard shades of sound. He distinguished the dull, womb-like cough of German howitzers and the sharp, screeching bark of mortars. But mostly, he learned to hear engines. "They're coming," whispered Grigoriev, not turning his head. His hands lay on his knees, relaxed, ready to spring. Voronov, pressed to the periscope, saw nothing. Before him was only the gray veil of dawn fog and the skeletons of factory structures. "Clear, Ilya. No one." "They're coming," the gunner repeated more firmly. "Wheeled vehicles, loaded, moving heavy, second gear. 3 machines, Opals. Their valves tap in a specific way. You can't confuse them with our trucks." A minute later, silhouettes floated out of the fog. Wehrmacht supply trucks. They were moving along a street under fire, confident the sector had been cleared. The Germans were carrying ammunition and winter uniforms to the front line, just a kilometer from here. They weren't afraid of a dead tank in the ruins. Voronov felt a chill run down his spine. The blind man didn't make mistakes. "I see them." The mechanic's voice became dry, businesslike. 3 boxes, range 400, broadside to us, just like on the shooting range." Inside the tank, work began to boil. Without fuss, without extra words, it was an assembly line of death, honed to automatism. "Reference point, corner of the warehouse. Right half turn." Clicks of the turret drives. Grigoriev worked the hand wheels smoothly, without jerking. He felt the inertia of the barrel. "On it," he dropped shortly. "First in the column, tracking him."
"Lead half a hoe."
Grigoriev traversed the turret, following his friend's voice. Voronov dictated the tracking speed, and the gunner's hands synchronized with the movement of the truck he couldn't see. "Fire!" The shot tore apart the morning silence. The fragmentation shell hit the engine compartment of the lead truck. The explosion blew the cabin to splinters. The vehicle swerved and stood across the road, blocking the way for the others. Flames instantly engulfed the bed. "Second target!" shouted Voronov. "The rear one! Left one turn!" The Germans spilled out of the truck beds like peas, trying to find cover. But there was no cover. There was only an open street and an invisible executioner. "Ready!" responded Grigoriev. The breech clanged, swallowing a new shell. "Fire!" The second truck flared up like a torch. The detonation of the ammunition in the bed turned the vehicle into a fireball, scattering death in all directions. The third truck tried to back up, but bumped its bumper into the burning wreckage of the first. The trap slammed shut. "Finish it," ordered Voronov. There was no pity in his voice, only cold calculation. "You can't let them go." Grigoriev sent the third shell, a precise hit in the gas tank. The Germans panicked, darting between the burning machines. They fired blindly at the ruins, at the windows of the workshops, not understanding where death had come from. They didn't see muzzle flashes. The tank fired from deep within the destroyed workshop, and the smoke dissipated inside the building, not giving away the position. For the Wehrmacht, this sector became a cursed place. They called it Das Gespenst, the ghost. Their reports spoke of a camouflaged anti-tank gun battery, of sniper tankers. It couldn't even occur to them that an entire sector was held by one wrecked tank with a crew of 2 cripples. Inside the machine, it reeked of gunpowder so bad it stung the eyes.
Voronov coughed, spitting out black phlegm.
"Clean," he exhaled. "All 3 burning." Grigoriev leaned back against the seat back. His hands were trembling with a fine tremor, not from fear, but from tension. The come-down after battle always hit the nerves. "How many were there?" he asked quietly. "Don't think," Voronov cut him off. "They aren't people. They are targets. Numbers in a report." They sat in the dark, listening to the flames crackling outside and the ammo cooking off in the German trucks. Grigoriev listened to these sounds like a musician to a complex score. He heard screams, but they didn't touch him. His soul seemed to have calloused, just like his fingertips, worn down against the metal of the hand wheels. War is a factory. They are the workers. Their machine tool is a cannon, and today they exceeded the quota. Lesha, the gunner's voice sounded hollow. Check the rack. How many left? 20 high explosive, 5 armor-piercing. Not much, the blind man stated. Enough for a day. And tomorrow? And tomorrow will be tomorrow, Voronov cut off. Rest. I'm on watch. Silence returned to the iron box. Outside, German hopes for warm underwear and cartridges were burning out. Inside, the metal cooled, and 2 men turned back into motionless parts of their mechanism, waiting for the next signal. The ghost of workshop number 3 went dormant. It knew no fatigue. It knew no mercy. It just waited. The Germans sent professionals. These weren't scared infantrymen or truck drivers dreaming of schnapps. These were Experten, hunters from a tank division, pulled from the main thrust specifically to clear the quadrant. 3 Panzer IV tanks with long-barreled 75mm guns. They moved not in a column, but in a fan formation, using wolf-pack tactics. They knew a beast was sitting in the workshop, and they were coming to kill it. Voronov saw the first glint of optics in the periscope. The sun, breaking through the smoke, treacherously flashed on the lens of the enemy's sight. Contact, the mechanic exhaled. His voice dropped an octave. It was fear, but a cold, mobilizing fear. 3 boxes, long barrels. They know where we are. Grigoriev froze. His hands, resting on the hand wheels, instantly turned to stone. He heard that tone in his friend's voice, the tone of a man looking into the barrel of a firing squad. Range? Asked the blind man. 600, spreading to the flanks, taking us in pincers. The first shell hit the frontal armor of the turret before they could turn the gun. The impact was so forceful that scale flaked off the inner lining. The sound wasn't deafening, it was soul-shaking, as if God himself punched the roof. Ricochet. The sloped armor of the T-34, the genius invention of designer Koshkin, saved the crew. The slug went into the sky, leaving a deep furrow on the steel, glowing white-hot. Alive? Yelled Voronov, checking himself and the gunner. Turret is okay. Grigoriev shook his head, shaking off the ringing. Give me a target. They're maneuvering. Voronov pressed himself against the observation device. The picture before him was jumping. First is coming from the left. Second is holding the center. Third is going behind the embankment. They are taking us apart, Ilya. We're a sitting duck. The tank shuddered from a second hit. This time the shell grazed the gun mantlet, jamming the machine gun. Metal screamed, sparks showered inside the fighting compartment. The situation was mathematically losing. A T-34, immobilized, against 3 maneuverable machines with excellent optics. Hit the lead! Shouted the mechanic. Turret left! Faster! Grigoriev began the rotation, but suddenly stopped. No, he said firmly. What do you mean, no? Voronov almost broke into a squeal. He's going to shoot! Turn! No, the blind man repeated. His face, crossed by scars, was frighteningly calm. If I shoot him in the front, I won't take him. It's 1942, Lesha, and they have reinforced armor. It'll be a ricochet. We'll only give ourselves away completely. A silence hung in the tank that rang louder than the cannonade. Voronov looked at the enemy tank slowly, with brazen confidence, crawling through the ruins, turning its turret in their direction. The muzzle brake of the German gun looked straight into the mechanic's soul. He's going to kill us, whispered Voronov. Wait, commanded Grigoriev. Let him believe we're dead. Let him expose his side. It was a game of nerves where the stake was life. The blind gunner was suggesting the sighted mechanic look at his own death and not blink. Grigoriev felt the vibration of the floor. He heard the rising roar of the German Maybach engine. He was building a three-dimensional model of the battle in his head, relying only on sound and intuition. "Where is he?" asked the gunner. 500 meters. Turning. Aiming. Wait. 400. Ilya, he's going to shoot! Wait! Barked Grigoriev. His fingers on the trigger turned white. He squeezed the metal so hard it seemed the handle would bend. Impact. The third shell hit the edge of the turret, tearing off a handrail and a chunk of armor. The tank rocked. Voronov smashed his face against the periscope. Blood flooded his eye. But he didn't turn away. "He decided we're done," the mechanic rasped, smearing blood over his face. "He's turning the gun away. He's going around to finish us in the side." The German ace made a mistake. He believed in his own invulnerability. The Panzer IV began a pivot turn, exposing its side profile to the shot. Thin, vertical armor hiding ammo racks and fuel tanks. "Side!" screamed Voronov. "Full profile!"
Turret left, 2 turns.
Grigoriev didn't rotate. He tore at the handwheel. Back muscles cracked from the strain. The heavy turret went left, catching up to the target. "More! A little more!" the mechanic corrected. His voice was a laser designator. "Stop!" The barrel of the Soviet gun froze, looking exactly at the center of the German cross on the side of the enemy machine. "Range 300. Armor piercing. Armor piercing up." Grigoriev already felt this shot. He felt it in his gut. "Take the gift." Press. A shot with a BR-350 armor-piercing slug is dry physics of destruction. The shell stitched through the air in half a second. It hit the side of the German tank at a 90-degree angle. German steel couldn't hold. The slug smashed through the armor, burst into the fighting compartment, and turned the insides of the enemy machine into a meat grinder. An instant later, the German tank bloated from within. Hatches were torn out by the roots. A pillar of fire struck the sky 3 stories high. The detonation of the ammo load tore the hull at the seams. "It's burning!" screamed Voronov. It wasn't a scream of joy, but of madness. "Burning, you bastard!" The other 2 German tanks, seeing the death of their commander, shied away to the sides, popping smoke screens. They didn't understand where the strike had come from. For them, the dead ruins had suddenly bristled with deadly fire. "Gone," the mechanic exhaled, sliding down the wall. "Gone behind the smoke. They're scared." Grigoriev slowly removed his finger from the trigger. His hands were shaking with a fine tremor. He breathed heavily, wheezing, drawing in the smell of burnt metal through his nostrils. "Are we still alive, Lesha?" he asked quietly. "Alive, brother. Alive." Voronov looked at his friend. The blind man sat in the gloom of the turret, covered in soot, with empty, terrible eyes in which blood had baked. But in that pose, in those hands resting on the gun, there was so much power that the mechanic felt afraid. War takes everything human from a person, leaving only a function. But it was exactly this function that had just saved their lives. "Load," Voronov said, returning to the periscope. "They'll come back." "I know," nodded Grigoriev, feeling for the next shell. "Let them come back. We aren't in a hurry." Trust in this tight space ceased to be an abstract concept. It became material, like the steel of the armor. The life of one depended on the word of the other. A second of delay, death. The wrong word, death. A trembling hand, death. They walked the razor's edge, and this experience welded them together stronger than the welds holding the hull plates. Now they knew. As long as one sees and the other shoots, this tank is immortal. The German tank didn't leave. It went to ground. The commander of the last surviving Panzer vehicle turned out to be an experienced beast. He realized that a direct duel with an invisible enemy in the ruins was suicide, and chose survival tactics. He drove his machine behind the semi-destroyed wall of the tool shop. Brickwork 3 meters high reliably hid the steel hull from eyes, and piles of debris protected the tracks. It was a perfect position. He didn't see the Soviet tank, but the Soviet tank couldn't reach him either. A stalemate. A chessboard where the pieces froze, awaiting the opponent's mistake. Voronov stared into the sector until his eyes stung. "I don't see him," he hissed through his teeth. "He's there, I know. I hear the engine. But no visual contact. The wall is blocking." The mechanic saw only the blue-gray exhaust smoke rhythmically rising above the crest of the brickwork. The smoke pulsed, betraying the operation of the German engine at idle. The enemy was close, some 50 meters away, but an insurmountable barrier stood between them. "Describe it," demanded Grigoriev. His voice sounded hollow, like from a dungeon. He sat motionless, tilting his head as if listening to the vibration of the walls. "Where exactly is the smoke?" "Reference point 3, red building, left corner. Smoke is coming from behind the wall, 5 meters from the edge. He's standing broadside to the masonry, waiting for us to stick our noses out." Grigoriev slowly nodded. In his head, deprived of light, a map lit up. Before the war, in that life that now seemed like a dream, he had worked at the tractor factory. He knew this workshop. He remembered the smell of oil in the tool room, remembered the layout of the machines, and, most importantly, he remembered the walls. "It's not concrete, Lesha," the blind gunner said quietly. "It's red brick, old masonry from the Tsarist era. Thickness, 1.5 bricks." "So what?" Voronov didn't understand. "I don't see the target. I can't aim at what isn't there." "We're going to hit them through the wall." Voronov tore himself away from the periscope and looked at his friend's back. It sounded like the ravings of a concussed man. Shoot an armor-piercing shell through a load-bearing wall in hopes of hitting a tank you can't see? This contradicted all artillery manuals. "You've gone crazy," the mechanic stated. "The slug will lose energy. It'll tumble. The fuse will trigger on impact with the brick. We'll just scratch his paint, and he'll blow us apart on the flash." "The armor-piercing is blunt-nosed," Grigoriev interrupted him. "It has a delayed fuse. Brick isn't armor to it. It's sand. The shell will pass, Lesha. It'll lose velocity but keep its mass. And behind the wall, the German has his side. 30 millimeters of steel. Cardboard." It was the physics of desperation, a calculation built on faith in kinetic energy and memory. Grigoriev didn't see the wall, but he felt its density. He knew that a 76mm shell weighing 6.5 kilograms, flying at the speed of sound, would turn brickwork into shrapnel. "Aim," the blind man ordered. "Right into the wall. A bit lower than where the smoke is rising. At hull level." Voronov hesitated for a second. It was madness, but it was their only madness for two. "All right," he exhaled. "Reference point, soot stain on the wall. Range 50. Point blank." "Turret left," Voronov commanded himself, watching the gun barrel rest against the blank red wall. It looked surreal. Execution of bricks. "Stop! Sight on the center of the masonry." "Load armor piercing," Grigoriev's voice became hard. "And pray he hasn't moved." The lock clanged. Shell in the barrel. Grigoriev put his hands on the mechanisms. He imagined this wall, imagined the German tank behind it, imagined the crew sitting in the warmth of the engine, drinking ersatz coffee and feeling safe. "Fire!" shouted Voronov, squeezing his eyes shut. The tank jerked with its whole body. The muzzle blast, reflected from the close obstacle, hit their ears with doubled force. Dust from the ceiling of the fighting compartment rained down on their shoulders. Outside, what happened is what ballistics textbooks call perforation of a barrier while maintaining lethal action. The BR-350A armor-piercing shell hit the brickwork. The brick couldn't withstand the point impact of monstrous energy. The shell didn't just punch a hole, it punched out a cone-shaped stream of secondary fragments: stone, cement, and the steel itself. The wall exploded inward. The slug, having passed through 1/2 meter of ceramic, lost 1/3 of its speed and began to tumble. But its mass was enough. It hit the side of the German 4 along with a cloud of brick dust. The weakened armor of the German tank couldn't withstand the combined blow of the shell and stone shrapnel. The metal cracked. The red-hot steel slug burst into the engine compartment, crushing engine cylinders, tearing fuel lines and wiring. "Hit!" yelled Voronov. He saw the wall collapse, and thick, black, oily smoke poured from the breach. It wasn't exhaust. It was diesel burning under pressure. A second later, it boomed so hard the ground under the T-34 tracks shook. The German ammo load detonated. Fire found the shells. The turret of the German tank was torn off the ring and tossed upward like the lid of a boiling pot. It flew over the remains of the wall and crashed down with a roar in front of the Soviet machine's nose. "It worked," whispered Voronov, not believing his eyes. "Ilya, you got him. Through the wall. You got him." Grigoriev dropped his hands helplessly. The adrenaline receded, leaving nauseating weakness. "I told you," he said quietly. "I built this workshop, Lesha. I know where its weak spots are." It was a triumph not of technology, but of the human factor. Where German optics and logic saw a dead end, the blind gunner saw an opportunity. He used the topography of the battlefield as a weapon. The environment ceased to be an obstacle, it became an extension of his will. Voronov looked at the acrid column of smoke rising above the ruins. In that smoke, the remains of German confidence in superiority were burning away. The enemy had encountered something irrational, a force that couldn't be calculated in headquarters. Blind rage multiplied by knowledge of native walls. "Changing position," Grigoriev's voice interrupted the euphoria. "They'll cover this spot with mortars now. They saw the flash." "Understood." Voronov engaged the gear. "Moving to Sector 4. The tank, clanking its tracks, crawled back deep into the ruins, leaving behind a smoking pile of brick and metal. They had won another round. But night was approaching, and with it came a new war. A war of sounds, rustles, and shadows. The time of the blind gunner. Night descended over the ruins of the tractor factory, not as relief, but as a suffocating shroud. For thousands of soldiers on both sides of the front, the onset of darkness meant a loss of control. Vision, the main tool of war, became useless. Shadows came alive, piles of trash turned into creeping enemies, and flares only blinded, burning out the retina. For the sighted, night was a time of chaos and paranoia. But for Grigoriev, nothing changed. Inside the armored hull of the T-34, darkness was a constant. It didn't scare him. It had been his working environment for 100 hours already. While Voronov, exhausted by concussion and tension, squinted into the black rectangle of the periscope, trying to discern movement in the impenetrable gloom. Grigoriev expanded his zone of control. Night removed excess noises. Artillery went quiet. Aviation went to airfields. The world became quieter, which meant transparent to hearing.
Lesha!
The gunner's voice sounded unnaturally loud in the cooling tank. Kill the engine. Completely. We'll freeze, the mechanic responded, teeth chattering. The temperature inside had dropped to freezing. Steam from their mouths settled as frost on the breech. Kill it! They're nearby. I can hear their skin. Voronov turned the key. The V2 diesel, jerking one last time, went silent. Absolute, cottony silence fell. The mechanic felt fear squeezing his throat with sticky fingers. He was blind. Without light, without the ability to see reference points, his vestibular system began to glitch again. It seemed to him the tank was falling into an abyss. I can't see anything, Ilya, he whispered. Ink. Pitch black. Where are they? Grigoriev sat motionless, closing his empty sockets, transforming into one solid auditory nerve. He scanned the space around the tank through the thickness of the armor. Metal didn't muffle sounds. It filtered them.
3 o'clock.
The blind man began listing. 20 meters. Rustle of canvas on brick. That's an assault group. They're crawling. I don't see... Voronov began. Quiet, hissed Grigoriev. 9 o'clock. Clatter of a carbine. Someone hit rebar with a barrel. They're flanking, surrounding us, prepping grenades. It was a German sapper team. Tank hunters. They moved quietly, professionally, in soft shoes, with duffel bags stuffed with TNT blocks and bundles of Model 24 grenades. They expected to catch the Soviet crew sleeping or deaf. They didn't know that inside sat a man for whom the sound of fabric rubbing against stone sounded like an air raid siren. Grigoriev placed his hands on the handles of the DT machine gun coaxial with the cannon. No help from the mechanic was needed here. The range was pistol shot. Do you see the darkness, Lesha? Asked the gunner, cocking the machine gun bolt. Yes. And I see the target. Suddenly, to the right, very close, came a dry click. The sound of a pull cord igniter being pulled. For Grigoriev, it was a starter pistol signal. He didn't wait for the explosion. He traversed the turret toward the sound, a sharp, short movement of hands governed by reflex. Pressing the machine gun trigger. A long burst tore the night silence. Muzzle flashes lit up the workshop with stroboscopic light, snatching figures in gray greatcoats from the darkness frozen mid-step from the tank. 7.62mm bullets, fired from a range of 15 meters, left no chances. They stitched through bodies, ricocheted off concrete, creating a zone of total destruction. Grigoriev swept the barrel left and right, orienting by screams and stomping. He saw the acoustic map of the battle. There on the right, a body fell, a dull thud of soft on hard. There on the left, someone ran, crunching broken glass. The machine gun immediately turned to the sound, sending a short burst. Left! Screamed Voronov, seeing a silhouette with a raised arm in the flash of gunfire. Grenade! Grigoriev didn't see the silhouette. He heard the breathing, the heavy, rasping breath of a man preparing to throw. Burst. The German crumpled without throwing. The grenade explosion thundered outside, 2 meters from the track. Shrapnel pinged off the armor like hail on a tin roof. The tank rocked, but the armor held. More coming! Voronov was disoriented by the flashes. Light and dark changed so fast his brain refused to process the picture. He was a passenger in this machine of death. Ilya, there's a lot of them! Calm, Grigoriev's voice was icy. I hear them all. It was a slaughter in the dark, where the blind man was the only one seeing. The Germans opened return fire with submachine guns. Bullets drummed on the turret, striking sparks, but it was useless. They were shooting at a silhouette, at flashes, while Grigoriev was shooting at living targets. He distinguished the sound of a German MP-40 reloading, the characteristic click of the magazine. A burst there. Silence. He heard a command in German. Vorwärts! Forward rush. A burst at the voice. A scream turning into a wheeze. Silence. The machine gun drum went empty. Drum! Shouted Grigoriev. Voronov, stumbling in the dark, ripped a spare drum from the rack. His hands were shaking. He dropped the magazine twice before he could hand it to the gunner. Grigoriev intercepted the drum in the air. One movement, the old one flew aside. Second, the new one snapped into place with a dry, metallic clack. Bolt back, fire. The fight lasted 3 minutes, but by density of events, it was hours. When the last burst went quiet, only moans and the crackle of cooling weapons could be heard outside. No one was crawling anymore. No one was clanking iron. The night attack had choked on its own blood. Grigoriev took his finger off the trigger. His ears were ringing, but through the ring, he continued to scan the airwaves. "Clear?" asked Voronov. His voice was hoarse from screaming. "Two breathing, heavy, wounded. The rest are silent." Voronov pressed his forehead to the periscope. His eyes adjusted to the dark. Dark mounds of bodies lay around the tank. The snow around was blackened by powder soot. "You laid them out, Ilya. The whole group. About 10 men. Point blank." "They were making noise," the blind man answered simply. "Making too much noise." In that phrase lay the whole essence of their new life. War ceased to be ideology or strategy. It became a set of physical quantities: volume of sound, reaction speed, density of fire. Grigoriev leaned back against the seat. He felt blood pulsing in his temples. The night that was supposed to be their end had become their ally. Darkness hid the tank, but exposed the enemy. "Lisha," the gunner called quietly. "Yeah?" "Give me some water. Throat's raw." Voronov held out a canteen. In the dark, their hands met. It was a handshake of two men standing on the other side of life. "You know what's scariest?" asked the mechanic, looking into the darkness of the hatch. "What?" "I'm afraid of dawn now. When the sun rises, I'll be a cripple again, and you, blind. But now we are gods." Grigoriev took a sip of warm, stale water. "There are no gods here, Lisha. Only mechanics. And we are part of it." They sat in silence, waiting for morning. The blind gunner turned back into hearing, guarding the sleep of his concussed friend. The T-34 tank stood among corpses, cold and terrifying, like a monument to itself. The night shift was over. Ahead was a new day, and it promised nothing but new pain. November 22nd, 1942, began not with dawn, but with vibration. The air trembled. German mortarmen had found the grid square. It wasn't aimed fire at the tank, but methodical, grid-pattern ploughing of the ruins. Mortars fell vertically, defying the laws of ballistics for flat trajectory fire, punching through workshop roofs and finding gaps in the ceilings. 120 millimeters, a heavy regimental mortar round. It didn't hit the turret. It found the most vulnerable spot, the louvers over the engine transmission compartment. The cast iron smashed through the thin grating. The explosion happened inside, right on the cylinder block of the V2 engine. Shrapnel slashed fuel lines.
Diesel, which until this moment had been the machine's blood, instantly turned into its executioner. Flash. The tank shuddered like an animal shocked by electricity. The bulkhead between the engine and fighting compartment glowed red instantly.
The flame didn't enter inside his tongues. It entered his pressure. The temperature jumped hundreds of degrees in a second. Oxygen burned out. Instead of air, the space filled with thick, oily black smoke, the product of burning diesel fuel and oil. "We're burning!" Voronov's scream wasn't audible over the roar of flames, but Grigoriev felt it. He felt the heat strike his face, singing his eyebrows. Breathing became impossible. His larynx spasmed. "Get out!" The mechanic was already beside him. He didn't waste time trying to put out the flames. They had no extinguishers. They had seconds before the fire reached the ammo rack. Shells would start bursting from overheating in a minute, or in 30 seconds. The death timer was running. Voronov grabbed the blind gunner by the collar of his coveralls. Yank. "Up! Ilya, climb!" The turret hatch was open, the only way to salvation. Grigoriev scrambled by feel, scraping skin off his fingers, choking, coughing black soot. His feet slipped on casings, hands sought leverage on red-hot metal. Voronov pushed him from below, bracing his shoulder against his buttocks, working like a jack. He was coughing blood. Concussed lungs couldn't handle the fumes. Grigoriev tumbled out onto the turret armor. The cold November air hit his face, but instead of relief, it brought a new threat. The tank was smoking like a volcano, attracting the attention of the entire front. Voronov climbed out after him. He was covered in oil and soot, shaking. He grabbed his friend's hand to pull him to the ground, into the saving shadow of the tracks. Dry crack. The sound was short, whipping, like a lash on plywood. Voronov jerked. His body arched. A German sniper's bullet, caliber .792, entered just below the left collarbone, punched through the lung, and shattered the spine. The kinetic energy of the bullet stopped his movement. He didn't fall to the ground. He collapsed onto the engine deck armor, right on the hot plates. "Lesha?" Grigoriev froze. He was holding his friend's hand, but the hand suddenly became heavy, limp. The fingers unclenched. The gunner, kneeling on the turret roof in the smoke, began fumbling around with his hands. "Lesha, get up! We have to jump!" He felt the body. Hot, sticky liquid was spurting from the mechanic's chest, soaking the quilted jacket. The smell of fresh arterial blood overpowered even the smell of burning. Grigoriev understood everything instantly. It wasn't a wound. It was the end. Voronov lay on his back. The sky above him was gray, indifferent. Pain came with a delay, dull, tearing, but he had no strength to scream. He felt life flowing out of him in spurts, in time with his weakening heart. His vision fogged, but through the veil he saw movement. 200 meters away, in a breach in the wall, a German crew was rolling out a PaK-40 anti-tank gun. They were hurrying. They saw the burning tank and the crew on the armor. They wanted to put a period at the end of the sentence. The gun barrel was turning in their direction. Voronov tried to inhale, but instead of air, his throat filled with blood. He rasped, "Ilya." It wasn't a voice, it was the rustle of a departing soul. Grigoriev leaned close to his friend's face, ear to his lips. "I'm here, brother. I'm here." "The gun!" Voronov gathered his remaining will into a fist. His eyes were glazing over, but his brain, that damaged, concussed brain, continued to work. He was giving targeting coordinates, the last ones in his life. "Straight." Where the chimney was. Right. 5. The blind gunner understood. He didn't drag his friend, didn't cry. There was no time for emotions. There was only the mission. The German gun was going to fire any second. Grigoriev dove back, into the hatch, into the inferno. Inside, there was nothing to breathe. The temperature was like a blast furnace.
The hair on his head crackled from the heat.
He fell into the gunner's seat, feeling no burns. His hands habitually found the hand wheels. Right. 5, he whispered, repeating the dying man's words. He traversed the turret, blindly, from memory, from the picture Voronov's voice had drawn for him. He felt the tank's metal groaning, ready to tear apart. There was a shell in the breech, the last high explosive. Grigoriev didn't hesitate. He pressed the trigger. The shot sounded dull, smeared. The gun recoil almost crushed his rib cage. Outside, the shell hit exactly under the shield of the German gun. The crew, who had already grabbed the firing lanyard, disappeared in an explosion cloud. The gun was thrown back, twisted scrap metal. Grigoriev, coughing, climbed back up. Strength was leaving him. Carbon monoxide was doing its job. His head spun, limbs were cotton. He fell out of the hatch and crawled to Voronov.
The tank beneath them was already humming. The fire had reached the ammo rack.
Lesha, done. I took him out. Lesha? Voronov lay motionless. His eyes were open, looking at the Stalingrad sky, but they no longer saw smoke or war. The pupils were dilated, reflecting gray clouds. Bloody foam had frozen on his lips. His hand, dirty, scarred, and oily, lay on the armor, as if trying to hold the tank, to keep it from leaving. Grigoriev touched his friend's face. The skin was still warm, but there was no pulse in the neck. Period. Finale. The symbiosis had broken apart. The mechanism broke because one of the parts had gone into eternity. The tank beneath them shuddered, a dull thump from inside. The first shell in the rack detonated. The armor jumped. Grigoriev, growling from powerlessness and pain, grabbed his friend's body by the straps of his coveralls. He couldn't leave him here, not on the armor that was about to fly to pieces. He pulled.
The body was heavy, unliftable, like the earth itself.
"Tell them," Voronov whispered a second before death. Or did Grigoriev just imagine it in the noise of the fire? The gunner rolled off the stern of the tank, dragging the dead mechanic with him, and they fell into a crater filled with dirty snow. A second later, the T-34's ammunition load detonated completely. The turret, weighing several tons, was torn off and flung aside. A pillar of fire struck the low sky, saluting the death of the crew, which ceased to exist as a combat unit, but remained in history as a single organism. Grigoriev lay at the bottom of the crater, pressing the cooling body to himself, and for the first time in a week, tears flowed from his empty, burned-out eyes. But these weren't tears of pity. It was lubricant leaking from a broken mechanism. Evacuation wasn't salvation. It was a forced amputation from reality.
Grigoriev was taken to the left bank of the Volga on a medical barge, along with hundreds of other stumps of war. The roar of Stalingrad remained behind, but in the gunner's head it didn't quiet down for a second. For him, the war didn't end with the loss of the tank. It just moved into a chronic phase, locked inside his skull. A rear hospital in Saratov met him with silence. It wasn't the tense, ringing silence before an attack, when the air is electrified with fear. It was the cottony, suffocating silence of sterility. Here it smelled not of cordite and burnt meat, but of carbolic acid, bleach, and boiled cabbage. These smells made Grigoriev nauseous. His organism, tuned for survival in hell, rejected safety as a foreign environment. For the first 2 weeks, he lay facing the wall, refusing to speak. Nurses thought it was shock. Doctors wrote in his chart, post-traumatic syndrome, total vision loss, multiple shrapnel wounds to the face. But Grigoriev was silent, not from shock. He was listening. He was trying to isolate Voronov's voice from the hospital noise. It seemed to him that if he focused, he would hear the raspy order, "Turret right, 2 turns." But all he heard was the shuffling of slippers, the creak of government-issue beds, and the groans of roommates. Loneliness covered him like a concrete slab. There, in the tank, he was part of a whole. He was half of a deadly mechanism. Here, he became just a blind invalid, Group 1, a useless social element that needed to be spoon-fed. When a nurse first tried to feed him semolina porridge, Grigoriev slapped the plate from her hands. "I'll do it myself," he growled. He ate with his hands, finding bread by touch, spilling soup on his robe. He was ashamed, but this was his battle. He was learning navigation in a world where there are no coordinates or target designations. A month later, they started teaching him to live again. An instructor, a cheerful rear echelon man, showed him how to use a cane. "Tap in front of you, comrade fighter. Sound bounces off obstacles." Grigoriev smirked. They were explaining echolocation to him like a child. To him, who determined the caliber of an incoming shell and the make of a German engine by ear. He went out into the corridor. The cane tapped on the parquet. Tap, tap. The sound was flat, wooden, no metal. In the assembly hall stood an out-of-tune piano. Grigoriev found it by accident. He ran his fingers over the keys. Cold bone. He pressed. The sound floated through the hall, a false D note. Grigoriev jerked his hand back as if burned. His fingers remembered something else. They remembered the ribbed steel of the aiming hand wheels. They remembered the weight of a shell. When he touched the keys, his brain substituted sensations. Instead of music, he heard the clang of a bolt. Instead of a melody, the rhythm of a machine gun burst. Art had died for him. Only the physics of murder remained. He decided to write a letter. Not home. He had no home left. His family died in a bombing in '41. He decided to write to a newspaper. He needed to record the fact of the crew's existence. If he didn't tell it, Voronov would disappear completely, turning into a line in a death notice, missing in action. He asked a young nurse, a girl with a thin, trembling voice, to write under dictation. Write, Stalingrad Front, November 1942. We were positioned in workshop number 3. Grigoriev dictated dryly, harshly, without adjectives. He described how armor cracks, how a burning tanker smells, how they shot through a wall, how Voronov died on the armor, continuing to aim the gun. The nurse sobbed, the pen scratching the paper. "Don't cry," Grigoriev cut her off. "Write the specs. Range 300, high explosive shell." The answer came 3 weeks later. The letter from the editorial office of the Frontline newspaper was read by the hospital's political officer. His voice was embarrassed. "Respected Comrade Grigoriev, your essay has been read. The editors admire your courage, but are forced to refuse publication. The events described appear technically impossible and improbable. A blind man cannot conduct aimed fire. This contradicts manuals and common sense. Furthermore, excessive naturalism and gloominess do not contribute to raising morale. We advise you to focus on recovery." Grigoriev sat on the bed, clutching the useless sheet of paper in his hand. Implausible. he repeated quietly. Improbable. So they didn't exist. So Voronov didn't burn alive saving him. So 3 German tanks blew up by themselves. The truth turned out to be too scary and too complex for newspaper columns. They needed poster heroes, rosy-cheeked and sighted, not 2 cripples in an iron coffin. That night, Grigoriev didn't sleep. He lay with open eyes, staring into his personal, eternal darkness. He realized that now he was the sole carrier of this memory. He was a living archive, the black box of a burnt tank. He began talking to the void. "Do you hear them, Lesha?" he whispered. "They say we didn't exist." In the silence of the ward, he imagined a familiar, barely audible muttering. Reference point, chimney, right 2 turns. Grigoriev smiled a terrible, crooked smile. The world of the living rejected their story. So be it. This story isn't for newspapers. It is burned onto the inside of his eyelids, imprinted in the pads of his fingers. He stood up, took his cane, and walked to the window. He didn't see the street, but he felt the cold of the glass. There, 1,000 kilometers away, Stalingrad was burning out. His life remained there. And here was only a posthumous existence. "We'll fight yet, Lesha," he said to his reflection in the dark glass. "As long as I remember, we are in formation." He learned to live with this bitterness. It became his fuel instead of diesel. He became a hard, difficult man. He didn't wear the medals they handed him before discharge. The Order of the Red Star lay in the nightstand, a cold piece of metal that weighed nothing compared to the weight of a 76mm shell. Grigoriev knew. His war would never end. It just went into standby mode. He was a blind gunner who lost his tank but kept his sight. And this sight was aimed at the past, where 2 crippled men did the impossible because they had no other choice. Mamayev Kurgan is swept by all winds. Here, at height 102.0, the air is denser than down in the city. It is infused not with the smell of steppe wormwood, but with the heavy, leaden spirit of memory. 1975, May. Crowds of tourists flow along the concrete stairs in a noisy, colorful river. They carry flowers, cameras, and loud conversations. But there is one visitor going against the current. An old man in a worn jacket moves slowly. He doesn't see the grandiose statue of the motherland slashing the sky with a sword, nor the strict geometry of the Pantheon. His navigation is the tap of a cane on concrete slabs and counting steps. His world is still immersed in absolute darkness, which fell for him 33 years ago in the tractor factory workshop. Grigoriev stops. He knows he has arrived. His hearing, sharpened by decades of life in the dark, picks out the necessary reference point from the crowd noise. Silence. Around this pedestal, people fall silent. Here stands a tank, a T-34. Not the one they burned in. That one long ago became rusty dust in the earth. This is a different tank, but the steel is the same. Same blood type. The old man raises a hand. His fingers, knobby, with the memory of grease ingrained in the skin, touch the cold armor. For passers-by, it's just green, rough metal, a museum exhibit. For Grigoriev, it is skin. He runs his palm along the sloped sheet of frontal armor. The cold burns his fingertips. "Hello?" he whispers. His fingers find a weld seam, a rough, uneven bead of metal. Grigoriev reads it like Braille. He recognizes the welder's handwriting. This isn't the neat factory soldering of peacetime. This is a seam from 42, hurried, angry, made by a teenager or a woman in an unheated Urals workshop. In this seam, Tension and haste are frozen. Hand slides higher. A dent on the turret. A smooth, melted crater in the steel. A ricochet mark. Grigoriev freezes. His breath catches. In this gouge, he feels the kinetic energy of the hit that didn't kill, but left a scar. He remembers that sound, the scream of metal that bursts eardrums. He walks around the tank in a circle, tapping the tracks with his cane. The tracks are silent. They are gripped tight to the concrete of the pedestal, but Grigoriev remembers how they sang in the frost. He remembers how this machine breathed, how it trembled with a fine shiver at idle. Now it is dead. But it is a majestic death. The death of a warrior who remained standing on eternal guard. Grigoriev walks up to the granite slab at the foot. He drops to one knee. Joints crack, age takes its toll, but the back remains straight. The back of a gunner used to sitting on a hard seat. He takes off his glove. A bare hand lies on the stone. Names are carved here, many names. But he is looking for one specific combination of ridges and grooves. A-L-E-X. Fingers read the letters. Alexei Voronov, mechanic driver. Trees rustle around, planted on blood. Somewhere far away hums modern Volgograd, alive, rebuilt, having forgotten the smell of burning. But here, at the point of contact between a blind man's hand and a dead man's name, time collapses into a point. Grigoriev doesn't cry. Tears are water, and water rusts metal. Their relationship was drier and stronger. "I am here, Lesha," he says to the granite. His voice is firm. It isn't an old man's complaint, it is a crew member's report. "We are still in formation." In his darkness, an image flashes. Not his friend's face, he has forgotten it. Time has erased the features. A sensation flashes. The sensation of a shoulder. The sensation of voice vibration in headphones. "You are watching," continues Grigoriev, stroking the cold letters. "You are always watching now. You have an excellent view from here, from the height. The whole city in the palm of your hand. No dead zones. And I am still shooting." He grips the handle of the cane like he once gripped the aiming hand wheel. "I tell about us, to everyone ready to listen. My words are shells, armor-piercing. I drive them into the heads of those who didn't see war, so they remember, so they know how skin crackles when you burn, how the fear you strangled smells." The symbiosis didn't break. The death of one didn't cancel the function of the other. The distance just increased. Now the connection between them is held not by wires of the tank intercom, but by memory. Grigoriev understands the main truth he walked toward for 30 years. Equipment is just iron. T-34, Tiger, Panther, these are just tools, coffins on tracks. The crew makes them a weapon, and trust makes them an invincible weapon. "Trust, Lesha," whispers the old man, rising from his knees. "It is the only weapon that doesn't misfire. You trusted me with your life when you became my eyes. I trusted you with my death when you dragged me out of the fire. We didn't let each other down." He stands leaning on his cane, a small, dry man against the backdrop of a huge sky and a huge tank. But in this figure, a monolithic heaviness is felt. He is not alone. Behind his left shoulder stands the mechanic driver unseen. The wind from the Volga picks up, trying to knock him off his feet, but Grigoriev stands firm. He is on his ground. He completed the combat mission. He survived not to live out his days, but to bear witness. "Stand down alert, third,"
he says into the void, which for him is full of presence. Rest. I assume the watch. He turns sharply in military fashion. The tap of the cane moves away, dissolving in the noise of the park. The tank remains. On its armor, where the blind man's hand touched, frost slowly melts, leaving a dark mark resembling a handprint. Metal remembers heat. History remembers truth. And as long as even one person on Earth can tell how a blind gunner and a concussed mechanic held the defense in a dead workshop, this war will not be lost to oblivion. The crew is eternal as long as their connection works. End of transmission.